I've been driving Uber for 2 years. My last passenger left a note in my car that said, "I'm sorry you had to be the one." I found the note at 3:47 in the morning, tucked between the seats where my last passenger had been sitting. The handwriting was shaky, like whoever wrote it had been crying or terrified or both. Just those 9 words on a torn piece of notebook paper, the ink smudged in one corner like a tear had fallen on it. I should have called the police right then. Should have reported it as suspicious, gotten it on record, protected myself. But I was exhausted after a 12-hour shift, my back aching from being behind the wheel, and I convinced myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a breakup note meant for someone else. Maybe part of some art project or prank. I crumpled it up, tossed it in my cup holder, and drove home to my apartment in South Seattle, thinking I'd forget about it by morning. I was wrong about that. So catastrophically wrong that even now, 3 weeks later, I can barely sleep without seeing that handwriting burned into my eyelids. My name is Derek, and I've been driving for Uber for exactly 2 years and 3 months. I started after I lost my job at a tech startup that went under, burned through their venture capital on a product nobody wanted, and laid off 80% of their staff on a cold morning in January. I was 34, had a useless degree in marketing, and needed to pay rent while I figured out what came next. Uber seemed like the obvious choice. Flexible hours, decent money if you worked the right shifts, and I could do it while sending out resumes and going to interviews. Except the interviews never led anywhere. The resume black hole swallowed everything I sent, and before I knew it, driving had become my full-time job. Not what I'd imagined for myself at this age, but it paid the bills and kept me busy enough to avoid thinking too hard about how my life had derailed. The passenger who left the note had requested a pickup at 2:53 a.m. from an address in Capitol Hill, outside a building I recognized as one of those new luxury apartments that cost $3,000 a month for a studio. I'd been parked near Pike Place Market, ending my shift, when the ping came through. The ride was going to Bellevue, across the lake, which meant good money and a chance to end the night on a high note. I accepted immediately and drove the 8 minutes to the pickup location, navigating the empty streets with the kind of autopilot precision you develop after thousands of rides. When I pulled up, I saw her immediately. A woman, maybe late 20s, standing under the building's entrance awning with a small suitcase beside her. She was wearing jeans and an oversized hoodie, her face partially hidden by the hood, and even from a distance, I could tell something was off about her body language. She kept looking over her shoulder, scanning the street like she was expecting someone to appear. Her hands were shaking when she reached for the car door handle. She got in the back without saying anything, which wasn't unusual. Plenty of passengers preferred silence, especially at this hour. I confirmed her name through the app, Melissa, and she nodded without making eye contact. I pulled away from the curb and headed toward the 520 bridge, the route the GPS had mapped out. The car was quiet except for the hum of the engine and the occasional sound of her shifting in her seat. I glanced in the rearview mirror a few times, trying to get a read on her, and each time I looked, she was staring out the window with this vacant expression that made my stomach tighten. Her hands were clasped in her lap, squeezing so hard her knuckles had turned white. About 5 minutes into the ride, she finally spoke, and her voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear her over the road noise. "Can you take a different route? Not the bridge, please." I adjusted the GPS to avoid 520 and take the I-90 instead, which would add maybe 10 minutes to the trip. "No problem," I said, keeping my tone neutral and professional. "Any particular reason?" She didn't answer right away, just kept staring out the window. Then, so softly I barely caught it, she said, "I can't go over water right now. I just can't." That should have been my first warning that this ride was going to be different. I'd had plenty of strange requests over the years. Passengers who wanted complete silence, others who wanted to talk about their entire life story, people who were drunk or high or having mental health crises. I'd learned to roll with it, keep things professional, get them to their destination safely. But something about Melissa felt more urgent than strange. The way she kept checking her phone every 30 seconds, the way her breathing would catch like she was trying not to cry, the way she flinched when we passed another car on the highway. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but I'd learned that sometimes people in Ubers didn't want questions. They wanted invisibility. Someone to drive them from point A to point B without acknowledging whatever crisis they were experiencing. So I kept quiet and focused on the road, taking I-90 across the lake while she sat in the back, radiating anxiety so intense I could feel it pressing against the back of my neck. We were about halfway across the bridge when her phone rang. The ringtone was loud in the quiet car, some default iPhone sound that made both of us jump. She looked at the screen, and I saw her entire body go rigid. She didn't answer it, just stared at the phone as it rang and rang, her face draining of color in the glow of the screen. When it finally stopped, she let out a breath that sounded like a sob. 10 seconds later, it started ringing again. Same ringtone, same reaction from her. This time, she declined the call and immediately powered off the phone, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "I'm sorry," she said to me, though I hadn't said anything. "I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have. This was a mistake. I should have just... I don't know what I should have done." I met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Are you in danger? Do you need me to call the police?" She shook her head violently. No police. Please, just get me to the address. That's all. Just the address." The rest of the ride passed in tense silence. She didn't look at her phone again, didn't look out the window, just sat there with her head down and her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together through sheer force of will. When we finally pulled up to the Bellevue address, a nice single-family home in a quiet residential neighborhood, she grabbed her suitcase and was out of the car before I could even put it in park. "Thank you," she said through the window, and then she was gone, hurrying up the walkway to the front door. I watched her knock, saw the door open immediately like someone had been waiting, and then she disappeared inside. I sat there for a moment, processing the ride, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. Something had been very wrong with that situation, but I didn't know what, and it wasn't my place to know. I was just the driver. I marked the ride as complete, saw the 5-star rating and $20 tip come through, and started heading home. That's when I noticed the paper on the seat. At first, I thought it was trash, maybe a receipt or something she'd dropped. But when I pulled over under a streetlight to check, I saw the handwriting. "I'm sorry you had to be the one." 9 words that made absolutely no sense. Sorry for what? The one what? I turned the paper over, looking for more context, but it was blank on the other side. Just that one sentence, written in blue ink on lined paper that looked like it had been torn from a spiral notebook. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was meant for someone else. Maybe she'd been carrying it to give to whoever lived in that house. Maybe it had fallen out of her pocket or her bag, but something about the placement felt deliberate. It had been tucked between the seats, not just dropped carelessly. And the timing, leaving it on this specific ride after behaving so strangely, felt intentional. I took a photo of it with my phone, then put it in my cup holder and drove home, telling myself I was overthinking it. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My first thought was that something had happened to my mom, who lived in Spokane, and was the only person who ever called me that many times in a row. But when I checked my phone, the calls were all from unknown numbers, and the texts were from people I didn't recognize. The first text I opened said, "You need to call me immediately. This is about Melissa Kaufman. This is Detective Luis Reyes with Seattle PD." My stomach dropped. I called the number with shaking hands, and Reyes answered on the first ring. His voice was clipped and professional. "Is this Derek Nolan, the Uber driver?" I confirmed, my mouth dry. "I need you to come down to the precinct as soon as possible. We have questions about a passenger you picked up last night, Melissa Kaufman. She's been reported missing, and you were the last person to see her." Missing. The word hit me like cold water. I'd dropped her off less than 8 hours ago. I'd watched her go into that house. How could she be missing? I told Reyes I'd be there in an hour, threw on clothes, and drove to the precinct with my mind racing. Had something happened after I left? Had someone taken her from that house? Was she in danger when I picked her up, and I'd just driven her straight into whatever she was running from? The guilt started creeping in before I even had answers. I should have asked more questions. Should have insisted on calling the police when she looked so scared. Should have done something other than just drive her where she asked and collect my fare like none of it mattered. At the precinct, Reyes and his partner, Detective Sarah Kim, took me into an interview room that smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner. They were both in their 40s, dressed in plain clothes, with the kind of exhausted faces that suggested they'd been working this case all night. Reyes started with the basics. Confirmed my identity, confirmed the ride, asked me to describe everything that happened from pickup to drop-off. I told them about the Capitol Hill apartment, about Melissa's demeanor, about her asking to avoid the bridge, about the phone calls she wouldn't answer, about watching her go into the Bellevue house. Kim was taking notes while Reyes watched me with an intensity that made me deeply uncomfortable. When I finished, he leaned forward. "The house in Bellevue. You saw her go inside?" I nodded. The door opened right away, like someone was expecting her. Reyes exchanged a look with Kim. "That house belongs to Richard Kaufman, Melissa's husband. He's the one who reported her missing. Says she never came home last night. Says she left their apartment around 3 a.m. after they had a fight, and he hasn't heard from her since." My brain stuttered trying to process that, but I watched her go in. She knocked, the door opened, she went inside. That was definitely the address on the app. Kim spoke for the first time, her voice gentler than Reyes. "We checked with Richard Kaufman. He says he wasn't home last night. He was staying at a friend's place after their fight. The house was empty. That didn't make sense. I'd seen the door open. I'd seen her go inside. Unless, could someone else have been there? A friend? A family member?" Reyes shook his head. "Richard says nobody else has a key. And here's the thing, Derek. We checked the house this morning. No signs of forced entry. No signs of a struggle. No signs that Melissa was ever there. Her suitcase isn't there. Her phone isn't there. It's like she vanished the moment you drove away." I felt the room tilt slightly. "That's impossible." I watched her. "We believe you," Kim said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But we need to establish a timeline. You dropped her off at what time exactly?" I checked my phone, pulled up the ride history. 3:41 a.m. The app has the exact timestamp. Reyes made a note. "And you drove straight home after that?" I started to say yes, then remembered. I pulled over a block away to check something. Both detectives perked up at that. "Check what?" I pulled out my phone and showed them the photo of the note. "She left this in my car, between the seats. I didn't find it until after I dropped her off. Reyes took my phone, zoomed in on the photo, and his expression changed. Became harder, more suspicious. I'm sorry you had to be the one. That's what this says? I nodded. I have the actual note in my car. I can get it for you. Kim left to retrieve it while Reyes continued questioning me. Did Melissa say anything that might explain this note? Anything about being sorry? About you being the one for something? I told him about her apologizing in the car, saying it was a mistake, saying she didn't know what she should have done. Reyes wrote everything down, his pen moving fast across his notepad. When Kim came back with the note in an evidence bag, they both studied it like it was a treasure map. We're going to need to keep this, Reyes said, and we're going to need you to stay available. Don't leave town. We may have more questions. They let me go after another hour of questioning, and I walked out of that precinct feeling like I'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. Melissa Kaufman was missing, and I was somehow involved in a way I didn't understand. The note kept echoing in my head. I'm sorry you had to be the one. The one for what? What had I been chosen for? What role was I supposed to play in whatever had happened to her? I drove home in a daze, checked the news obsessively for updates, but found nothing. The story hadn't hit the media yet. It was just a missing person case, one of hundreds that happened every year, most of which resolved themselves within 48 hours. But I knew this one was different. I'd felt it in that car, in the way Melissa had looked at me in the rearview mirror, in the way she'd left that note like a confession or a warning or both. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept playing the ride over and over in my head, looking for details I'd missed, clues I should have picked up on. The phone calls she wouldn't answer, the way she'd asked to avoid the bridge, the way she'd said, I just can't, about going over water, like it triggered something for her. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with a news alert. Body recovered from Lake Washington, female, late 20s, identity pending. My hands were shaking as I clicked the article. The body had been found by an early morning fisherman near the Evergreen Point floating bridge, the 520 bridge that Melissa had asked me to avoid. The article didn't name the victim, but I knew. Somehow, I knew it was her. I called the detective number Reyes had given me, and he answered immediately despite the hour. It's her, isn't it? I said without preamble. Reyes was quiet for a long moment. We can't confirm identity until we notify next of kin. But Derek, I need you to come back in. We have more questions, and you're going to need a lawyer. The line went dead, and I sat there in my dark apartment, understanding finally clicking into place with horrible clarity. Melissa hadn't gone into that house. She'd never intended to go into that house. She'd used me to get to the bridge she'd asked me to avoid, and then she'd done something I couldn't let myself fully process yet. The lawyer my mom helped me hire was named David Strauss, a criminal defense attorney with 25 years of experience and a face that had seen every variation of human darkness. He met me at my apartment before we went to the precinct, and his first words to me were, "Don't say anything without me present. Nothing, even if you think it helps. Especially if you think it helps." At the precinct, Reyes and Kim were waiting with another man I didn't recognize, someone from the prosecutor's office. The energy in the room had shifted from investigative to accusatory. Reyes started the interview by confirming what I already knew. The body from the lake had been identified as Melissa Kaufman. Cause of death, drowning. Time of death, estimated between 3:45 and 4:15 a.m., right after I'd dropped her off. Here's what we know, Reyes said, laying out photos on the table. Melissa left her apartment at 2:53 a.m. after a fight with her husband. She requested an Uber driven by you. During the ride, she asked you to avoid the 520 bridge and take I-90 instead. You dropped her at an address in Bellevue. Approximately 15 minutes later, her body entered the water near the 520 bridge. I started to speak, but Strauss put a hand on my arm. How did she get from Bellevue to the bridge? Strauss asked. That's what we're trying to determine, Kim said. There's no record of her calling another Uber or Lyft. No taxi companies have records of picking her up. The house where Derek dropped her off is a quarter mile from the nearest bus stop, and no buses run that route at 4 a.m. Reyes leaned forward. So here's what we're thinking, Derek. What if you didn't actually drop her in Bellevue? What if you drove her to the bridge instead? What if something happened during that ride, something you haven't told us about? Strauss cut in immediately. My client has been fully cooperative. He's provided his ride history, his GPS data, his phone records. Everything supports his account. GPS can be spoofed, Reyes said. Apps can be manipulated. And we have a dead woman who asked to avoid a specific bridge and ended up in the water next to that exact bridge within minutes of being in your client's car. The implication was clear. They thought I'd killed her, thought I'd driven her to the bridge, done something to her, dumped her body in the water, and made up the story about dropping her in Bellevue. The note suddenly took on a different meaning in their eyes. Not a confession from Melissa, but evidence of premeditation on my part. Maybe I'd written it myself to establish some kind of defense. The interview lasted 3 hours, and by the end, I was being told not to leave the city and to make myself available for further questioning. I wasn't under arrest, not yet, but Strauss told me on the way out that I was their primary person of interest. They're building a case, he said grimly. The circumstantial evidence looks bad. You were the last person to see her alive. She left a cryptic note in your car. She ended up dead in water she specifically asked you to avoid. They're going to try to create a narrative where you're a predator who targeted her. I felt sick. I didn't do anything. I just drove her where she asked. I believe you, Strauss said. But belief doesn't matter in court. Evidence matters. And right now, the evidence is pointing in a very bad direction for you. The story hit the news the next day. Uber driver under investigation in drowning death of Capitol Hill woman. My name wasn't released, but it didn't matter. Within hours, my phone was flooded with messages from other drivers, from passengers who'd ridden with me, from people I'd gone to high school with who suddenly remembered I existed. The court of public opinion was swift and merciless. Drivers in the Uber Facebook groups were already calling me guilty, saying they'd always known there was something off about me. Passengers were claiming they'd felt unsafe in my car, even though their actual ratings of me had been universally positive. My mom called crying, asking what was happening, and I couldn't explain it to her because I didn't understand it myself. How had I gone from driving someone to their requested destination to being investigated for their murder in less than 48 hours? Strauss told me not to engage with any of it. Don't read the news. Don't respond to messages. Don't try to defend myself publicly. Anything I said could and would be used against me. So I sat in my apartment, watching my life implode, while detectives tore apart every ride I'd ever given, looking for patterns, looking for other victims, looking for anything that would confirm their theory that I was a killer. Day 3, they found something. Or rather, someone found something and brought it to them. Richard Kaufman, Melissa's husband, had hired a private investigator to look into her death, and that PI had discovered something that made my blood run cold. 3 months before her death, Melissa had filed a police report. She'd claimed that someone was following her, that she'd seen the same car outside her apartment multiple times, that she'd received strange messages from an unknown number. The report had gone nowhere because she hadn't had enough evidence to identify who was stalking her, and the incidents had stopped after a few weeks. But now, with her dead, that report took on new significance. And according to the PI, the car Melissa had described matched mine, a silver 2015 Toyota Camry, the most common car on the road, driven by thousands of people in Seattle alone. But to the detectives building their case against me, it was one more piece of evidence. Strauss got me a copy of the police report, and I read it in disbelief. Melissa had been afraid for months. Someone had been terrorizing her, and now they were trying to pin it on me. I'd never seen her before that night, had never picked her up as a passenger before, never been to her apartment, never had any contact with her until she got in my car at 2:53 a.m. But proving a negative is nearly impossible. How do you prove you didn't do something? How do you prove you weren't somewhere when there are no cameras, no witnesses, no alibi? Strauss suggested we hire our own PI to look into Melissa's life, to find out who actually had been following her, who had reason to want her dead. Because here's what I think happened, Strauss said, laying out his theory. Someone was after her. That's why she ran that night. That's why she was so scared in your car. That's why she left that note, because she knew something bad was about to happen, and she wanted someone to know it wasn't random. You weren't the perpetrator, Derek. You were the witness, and that note was her way of apologizing for dragging you into whatever she was running from. It made sense. It made more sense than the police's theory that I was a calculating predator who'd somehow planned and executed a perfect murder. But sense doesn't always win in the legal system. The PI we hired was a former cop named Angela Reeves, who specialized in cold cases and had a reputation for being thorough. She started digging into Melissa's life, and what she found was disturbing. Melissa had been married to Richard for 3 years, but the marriage had been troubled from the start. Friends described Richard as controlling and possessive. Co-workers said Melissa had started showing up to work with bruises she'd try to cover with makeup. Her therapist, who Reeves managed to interview after getting around confidentiality laws, said Melissa had been planning to leave Richard for months, but was terrified of how he'd react. She told me he'd threatened her, the therapist said. Said if she ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure she regretted it. She'd talked about getting a restraining order, but was afraid it would escalate things. Reeves brought all of this to Strauss, who immediately filed motions to introduce it as evidence of alternative suspects, but the prosecutor's office pushed back hard. They argued that Richard had an airtight alibi for the time of Melissa's death. He'd been at his friend's apartment, and that friend confirmed it. They had security camera footage of Richard entering the building at 11 p.m. and not leaving until 8 a.m. Unless he can teleport, the prosecutor told the judge, Richard Kaufman didn't kill his wife. But Reeves wasn't done. She started looking at Richard's friends, his associates, anyone who might have helped him. And she found someone interesting, a guy named Vincent Ortega, Richard's college roommate, who worked as a private security contractor. Vincent had military training, access to surveillance equipment, and a history of doing questionable favors for Richard. Reeves pulled Vincent's financial records and found a $15,000 deposit into his account 2 days before Melissa died, paid by Richard. When questioned by police, Vincent claimed it was repayment for a loan, but Reeves found no evidence of any loan, no paper trail, nothing to support that story. She theorized that Richard had paid Vincent to follow Melissa, to scare her, maybe even to kill her. And when Melissa ran that night, calling an Uber in desperation, Vincent had followed my car, had waited for me to drop her off, then. But how did she end up in the lake? I asked Reeves when she laid out her theory. If I dropped her in Bellevue and Vincent was following, how did he get her from that house to the bridge? Reeves pulled up a map. The house is a quarter-mile from Lake Washington. There's a small park with lake access right there. If Vincent grabbed her before she could get inside the house, if he forced her down to the water, that's where she went in. Strauss filed an emergency motion to compel the police to investigate Vincent Ortega. Judge Patricia Blackwell, who was overseeing the preliminary hearings, agreed that there was enough circumstantial evidence to warrant further investigation. Reyes and Kim, who'd been building their case against me, were forced to pivot and start looking at Vincent. What they found changed everything. Vincent's car, which he'd claimed was being repaired the night of Melissa's death, had actually been seen on traffic cameras heading toward Bellevue at 3:38 a.m. His phone records showed he'd been in the area of the Kaufman house at the time I dropped Melissa off. And most damning, when police searched his apartment with a warrant, they found Melissa's phone hidden in his closet, still powered off. Vincent was arrested on suspicion of murder. Under interrogation, he maintained his innocence for 6 hours before finally breaking. He admitted that Richard had paid him to scare Melissa, to follow her and make her think twice about leaving. He claimed he never intended to kill her, that it was an accident. She saw me following the Uber, Vincent told detectives in a recorded confession. She figured out what was happening. When the driver left, she ran. I caught up to her near the lake. We struggled. She fell, hit her head on something. I panicked, pushed her into the water. I didn't mean for her to die. I was just supposed to scare her. Richard Kaufman was arrested the next day as an accessory to murder. The evidence against him was circumstantial. The $15,000 payment, text messages between him and Vincent that could be interpreted as planning, Melissa's therapist's testimony about his threats, but combined with Vincent's confession, it was enough for the prosecutor to move forward. I was officially cleared of any involvement. Strauss held a press conference where he excoriated the Seattle Police Department for their rush to judgment, for focusing on me instead of doing proper investigative work, for nearly destroying an innocent man's life. But the damage was already done. My name had been in the news. My face had been on TV. People knew who I was now, and they knew me as that Uber driver who was investigated for murder. Even though I'd been cleared, even though the real killers were in custody, the stain remained. I lost my ability to drive for Uber. The company deactivated my account, citing violations of their community standards. Didn't matter that I'd been cleared. Didn't matter that I'd done nothing wrong. The mere association with a murder investigation was enough to make me unemployable in their eyes. I applied to Lyft, to DoorDash, to every gig economy platform I could find. All of them rejected me. Background checks flagged the investigation, and none of them wanted the liability. 6 months after Melissa's death, Vincent Ortega pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for testifying against Richard Kaufman. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Richard's trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution argued that he'd orchestrated his wife's murder, paying Vincent to do the actual killing while maintaining an alibi. The defense argued that Richard had only paid Vincent to follow Melissa, that Vincent had acted independently when he killed her, and that Richard was guilty of nothing more than bad judgment. The jury deliberated for 4 days before finding Richard guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and being an accessory after the fact. He was sentenced to 18 years. At his sentencing, he was given the opportunity to speak. He stood up, looked directly at me sitting in the gallery, and said, "I didn't kill my wife. Vincent killed my wife. And you drove her right to him. If you'd just taken her somewhere safe anywhere else, she'd still be alive. So yeah, I'm sorry you had to be the one. Sorry you have to live with that." The judge gavelled him down, but the words had already been said, already landed. Because he was right, wasn't he? I'd driven Melissa exactly where she'd asked to go, followed my GPS, done my job, and in doing so, I'd delivered her to her death. The note made sense now. I'm sorry you had to be the one. Melissa had known Richard would come after her, had known that running would end badly, and she'd apologized to me, the random Uber driver who'd gotten caught in the middle of her nightmare, for involving me in something that would haunt me forever. I go to therapy now, trying to process the guilt and the trauma and the surreal experience of being investigated for a murder I didn't commit. My therapist keeps telling me it wasn't my fault, that I couldn't have known, that I was just doing my job. But I can't shake the feeling that if I'd asked more questions, if I'd insisted on calling the police when I saw how scared she was, if I'd done literally anything different, maybe Melissa would still be alive. I don't drive anymore. Can't imagine getting behind the wheel, picking up strangers, not knowing if I'm driving them toward safety or toward their death. I got a job doing data entry for an insurance company, boring work that keeps me inside and away from people and their complicated, dangerous lives. Sometimes I still find myself checking the news, looking for updates on Richard's appeals or Vincent's parole hearings, wondering if they'll get out early, if they'll come looking for me, if this story has more chapters I haven't lived through yet. The note is in an evidence box somewhere, tagged and filed and forgotten by everyone except me. Those 9 words that changed my life. I'm sorry you had to be the one. I was the one. The witness. The person who saw Melissa in her final hours and couldn't save her. The person whose testimony helped convict her killers, but who will always carry the weight of that ride, that night, That moment when I dropped her off and drove away, not knowing I was leaving her to die.